For 10 long years, Thomas Rayburn had lived alone, nestled deep within the folds of Wyoming's rolling prairie. His ranch, once alive with the sounds of laughter, hammering hooves, and warm conversation, had gone eerily silent. The house, a solid two-story structure built by his own hands, stood like a forgotten outpost in a sea of grass, weathered by time and memory. Time didn't move the same way out there. Days bled into one another, the sun rising and falling with mechanical precision, but rarely stirring anything in his heart. Since the day he buried his wife and infant son, lost to the fever that swept through the Valatomas, had become something like a shadow of himself. He still walked the fields, still mended fences, still tended to the cattle and the windmill, but there was no urgency, no joy, no human connection to anchor him. He survived more than lived. In those early years after the tragedy, people from town had tried to check in neighbors like old Hank, the storekeep's boy, even the preacher. But Thomas had shut them all out, not cruelly, but completely. He didn't rage or drink or shout. He just withdrew. He spoke only when absolutely necessary and came to town, perhaps once every 2 months, for feed, salt, and coffee. Even then, his eyes were distant, his beard overgrown, his presence like a ghost with boots on. Folks respected his grief and eventually stopped trying. Over time, they simply referred to him as that lone rancher out near Red Rock. Children spun stories about him. Some said he'd gone mad. Others whispered that the ranch was haunted by his family. But most adults knew better. Thomas Rayburn was simply a man who had once loved too deeply and lost it all. The ranch itself remained functional but bare. Where there had once been flower beds and wind chimes, now there was only dust and creaking wood. Where once a woman's laughter had bounced off the porch rails and a baby's cry had echoed from the nursery upstairs, there was only the sigh of wind through broken shutters. Thomas kept things running because it gave his hands something to do. He didn't let the barn fall apart, didn't let the animals go hungry, but he never added to the place either, never planted new trees or painted the fences. There was no one to impress, no reason to expand, no future to build toward. It was a suspended life, and in its own quiet way. That loneliness had settled into his bones like winter frost. He had his routines: up before sunrise, coffee black as pitch, then out to feed the animals. He'd ride the perimeter of the property every 2 days, checking for signs of trespassers or predators. He read old books by lantern light and once in a great while, played a few somber notes on the dusty upright piano his wife had loved. On Sundays, he sat on the porch and watched the sky, remembering the life that used to fill the space beside him. He had accepted, in his own worn-down way, that this was how it would end, quietly, slowly, without anyone noticing. And then on one storm-thick night in early June, everything changed. The day had started normally, dry winds in the morning, clouds gathering by afternoon. By dusk, the sky was bruised purple and heavy with thunder. Rain came down in sheets, pounding the tin roof, rattling the windows. Thomas had lit the fire, poured himself a cup of bitter coffee, and was about to settle into his worn armchair when something strange happened. A thud, dull but solid code from the front porch. He sat still, frowning, waiting for the wind to explain it. Then came a second sound, a dragging, scraping motion, like something or someone trying to move. He stood, slow and deliberate, his mind suddenly alert. Grabbing the shotgun that rested by the doorframe, he swung open the front door, expecting perhaps a coyote, maybe a tree branch. But what he saw froze him to the spot. Lying on the porch, drenched head to toe, was a young woman in a wedding dress. The white fabric was soaked and mud-streaked, clinging to her thin frame. Her veil was torn. Her lips were blue. Her fingers curled weakly around the wooden planks as she tried to lift her head but failed. Thomas didn't hesitate. Instinct overtook him, something deep, human, and buried long ago. He set down the gun, stepped into the rain, and lifted her into his arms. His quiet world had just been broken open. The rain was relentless that night, thick sheets of cold water slapping against the walls of the cabin and rattling the windows like skeletal fingers. Thunder growled across the open plains, and lightning lit up the vast Wyoming landscape in brilliant, ghostly flashes. Thomas Rayburn had never feared storms. In fact, he'd grown used to their company. They were wild, untamed, and brutally honest, like the land itself. But what he heard just after midnight, through the heavy rhythm of the storm, wasn't thunder. It was something softer, stranger, out of place. A sound that didn't belong to wind or rain. A thump. Then another, lighter and irregular, like a hand dragging across rough wood. Thomas had just set his coffee down when he paused, listening with the trained ear of someone who knew every creak and groan is homemade. The sound came again. This time, he reached for the shotgun, leaning near the door. He wasn't expecting trouble, but out here, miles from the nearest neighbor, you learned to be cautious. Carefully, he swung the door open. Rain slapped him in the face instantly, soaking his shirt and plastering his hair against his forehead. The lantern behind him cast a weak yellow glow across the porch, just enough to illuminate a figure crumpled in a heap at his feet. For a heartbeat, Thomas didn't understand what he was seeing. A woman, in a wedding dress, She lay on her side, motionless except for a tremble in her shoulders. Mud streaked the white satin. Her veil was torn and tangled. Around her face, one bare foot peeked from under the soaked fabric, scraped and bloody. She groaned faintly, her fingers twitching as if trying to rise again. "Hey," Thomas called over the wind, kneeling beside her. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" She stirred weakly, eyes fluttering open just for a moment before rolling back. He saw no sign of weapons, no indication she was a threat. She was half-conscious, soaked to the bone, and dangerously cold. Without wasting another second, Thomas set the shotgun aside and gently scooped her up. Her body was cold and limp in his arms. He stepped back inside and kicked the door shut with his boot. The warmth of the fireplace hit them both, steam rising instantly from her drenched dress. He laid her carefully on a woven rug near the hearth, cradling her head with a folded towel. She murmured something, just a whisper of sound unintelligible. He removed the soaked veil from her head and saw her face fully for the first time. She was young, early 20s, maybe. High cheekbones, dark lashes heavy with rainwater, lips cracked from exposure. A bruise darkened her left temple, as though she'd fallen or been struck. Thomas's hands moved quickly, but gently. He pulled a blanket from the old cedar chest and wrapped it around her, then stoked the fire higher until the logs crackled with orange heat. He placed a pot of water over the flames and brought over a clean rag, dabbing at her forehead, wiping the mud from her cheeks. All the while, he kept glancing toward the window, half expecting someone to come crashing in after her, whoever she'd been running from. He didn't speak much. He hadn't spoken much to anyone in years. But he found himself murmuring things. "Anyway, you're safe now," he said softly. "Whoever you are, you found the right place." She stirred at the sound of his voice, a faint whimper escaping her lips. Then she slipped into unconsciousness again. He sat by her side for a long while, one hand still resting protectively near her shoulder, as the firelight danced across the room. The storm outside showed no signs of easing, but Thomas was no longer thinking about the weather. His world, so carefully shielded for a decade, had just been interrupted in the most surreal, haunting way. A bride half dead and soaked through on his porch. It made no sense, and yet it felt like a strange kind of fate had arrived on the wind. And as he watched her shiver, safe for now beneath his roof, Thomas realized that something inside him, something long dormant, had begun to stir. When morning finally broke over the prairie, it did so gently, casting long amber rays across the dew-drenched grass. The storm had passed sometime just before dawn, leaving behind a sky scrubbed clean and pale blue, dotted with soft clouds. Thomas Rayburn stood at the window, staring out at the wet earth and his battered porch. But his thoughts were entirely with the woman asleep beside his hearth. She hadn't moved much during the night, just the occasional twitch of her fingers, a soft moan now and then, and a few feverish murmurs he couldn't decipher. But her breathing had steadied. Her skin, which had been icy and colorless, now carried the faintest flush. She was alive, though still fragile, like a bird stunned. From flying into a window, Thomas hadn't slept. Not because he was afraid, but because he was alert in a way he hadn't felt in years. The presence of another human in his house had awakened something primal in him, an old instinct to protect, a sense of purpose. He had built this house with his wife. Every floorboard, every beam, every window carried memories. And now, after 10 long hollow years, someone was here again. It felt surreal, as if he were caught in a dream he hadn't asked for. He moved quietly through the cabin, boiling fresh water, preparing broth from the dried vegetables and salted meat he kept stored. Every motion felt unfamiliar. A second bowl, pouring a second cup of tea. He could hardly remember the last time he had done that. As the food simmered gently, he took a clean flannel shirt and a pair of linen pants from a chest upstairs, his late wife's old clothing still neatly folded, untouched by time. He hesitated before bringing them down, his hand lingering on the buttons of the blouse, remembering her hands folding them with care so long ago. When he returned to the hearth, the young woman was stirring. Her eyes fluttered, open green eyes, vivid even in their confusion, and locked onto his face. She flinched slightly, trying to sit up, but her body protested. Thomas quickly raised his hands in a calm, non-threatening gesture. "Easy," he said gently, his voice hoarse from disuse. "You're safe." She blinked, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak. Her throat worked hard to form words, but nothing came, only a dry, croaked whisper. Thomas poured a cup of warm water and knelt beside her, holding it up. "Here's small sips." She drank, though weakly, and after a moment let out a long, shuddering breath. Her gaze scanned the room slowly, landing on the fire, the rug, the window. She seemed to realize she was no longer outside, no longer at the mercy of the storm. Relief washed across her face, but it was chased quickly by something else. Panic. "My," she started, then winced, clutching her side. "I have to." "You don't have to do anything right now," Thomas said calmly. "You're hurt and soaking wet. Whoever you are, wherever you were headed, you're here now. You're safe." She looked at him, then really looked, and something in his quiet, tired eyes seemed to reach her. She didn't speak again, but she didn't resist either. He handed her the dry clothes and stepped out of sight to give her some privacy, listening as she slowly, shakily dressed herself. Every sound from her side of the room, every cough, every shift of fabric felt like life returning to the old house. When she finally emerged from behind the screen, still pale, but dressed and sitting upright, Thomas brought her a bowl of broth and a piece of bread. She accepted it with shaking hands, eyes glistening, and though she barely spoke, there was a look in her expression that asked 100 questions who he was. What kind of man would take in a stranger, and what might come next? He didn't press her. Not yet. She would talk when she was ready. But as he sat across from her, silent but present, something unspoken passed between them, something heavy with mystery, pain, and perhaps even fate. She had collapsed at his doorstep like a ghost out of time, but now, in the light of morning, she was something more, a question that would change everything. Thomas had never been the kind of man who asked questions right away. He'd learned, through years of ranching and grieving, that people spoke when they were ready and not before. So, while a dozen curiosities buzzed in his head, he bit them back and simply watched over the young woman in silence. Her strength was returning slowly. By mid-morning, she had managed to eat a full bowl of broth and take a few more sips of water. She looked less like a broken specter and more like a person, again, though the pain in her eyes hadn't left. If anything, it had deepened, as if she were trying to keep something down that threatened to rise. She hadn't told him her name yet, and Thomas hadn't told her his. That didn't feel important, not yet. There was something fragile in the space between them, like a rope bridge stretched between cliffs, and he didn't want to shake it. So, he did what he knew how to do: chores. He left her resting on the couch and went out to feed the horses, check the chicken coop, and gather dry wood for the stove. The sky was crisp, washed clean by the storm, and the earth smelled like wet hay and pine. But even as he worked, he kept glancing back at the cabin, thinking of the woman inside, how strange it felt to leave someone behind. How long it had been since he'd had to consider another person's needs. When he returned, the fire was still going strong, and she was sitting up now, wrapped in the thick wool blanket, staring into the flames. Her wet wedding dress lay in a pile near the hearth, limp and muddy, like a piece of shed skin. She had braided her damp hair back from her face, clumsily, but neatly, and Thomas could see the sharp lines of her cheekbones more clearly now. There was a quiet strength in her that hadn't been visible when she'd collapsed on his porch, a steel spine behind those exhausted green eyes. He cleared his throat gently, not wanting to startle her. "You should rest," he said softly. "You've been through something." She looked up at him, eyes searching his face. For a moment, he thought she might ignore him, but then she spoke just one sentence. "I didn't know where else to go." Thomas nodded slowly. "You're not the first to feel that way out here." A long silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Outside, the wind rustled the prairie grass, and the occasional creak of the wooden beams reminded them they were still in the world of men, still grounded. Finally, she broke the quiet again. "They were chasing me." Thomas's hand froze on the stove handle. He didn't move for several seconds. He asked finally, his voice calm but firm. She shook her head, as if the answer was too big for words. "Men, horses. I didn't know them. I ran for hours. I thought I could lose them in the storm. I thought maybe if I just kept moving, anyone might help." Her voice cracked then, the memory catching up with her. Thomas felt a flicker of something dark stir inside him. He wasn't a lawman, wasn't even a man with a phone line, but he knew danger when he heard it. The desperation in her tone, the fear behind her carefully chosen words, it was real, and it meant whoever had been after her wasn't far behind. "You did the right thing coming here," he said quietly. "You'll be safe. I'll see to that." She looked at him then with an expression that nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. Not gratitude exactly, but something heavier. A kind of disbelief that anyone would still say something like that to her. Like she had long stopped expecting mercy from the world. Outside, the sky was beginning to clear completely. But inside the cabin, the storm was far from over. By midday, the sun had broken fully through the clouds, and golden light streamed through the cabin's front window. The prairie, still damp and glistening, shimmered under the sun's warmth. But inside the ranch house, a different tension had taken hold, a quiet unease that pressed in around both of them like a slowly tightening rope. Thomas had seen the look in her eyes before, not in women, but in animal strays that wandered onto the land, wild and wounded, never sure if the hand reaching toward them meant food or pain. It was a look of someone who had been chased too long, hurt too deeply. He didn't ask her anything else, not yet. Instead, he went about his day as naturally as he could, keeping the fire fed, tending to the horses, and making sure she had food and space. But all the while, a thought began to grow in the back of his mind, uncomfortable and persistent. If she was being hunted, whoever had chased her could still be out there, somewhere, maybe not far. He found himself watching the horizon more than usual. Every movement in the grass caught his eye, the crows circling above, the distant rustle of deer. Even the wind whistling through the old fence posts, he noticed it all. The land had taught him to read signs. If someone was coming, the prairie wouldn't stay quiet for long. Back in the cabin, she had finally gathered enough strength to stand, wrapped in a dry shawl and leaning on the table for support. She wandered to the window and gazed out across the empty plains. The wedding ring on her finger was gone, either lost or never worn to begin with, but the dress, crumpled near the fireplace, was undeniable. She'd been a bride. Of what kind of wedding, Thomas didn't dare guess. She noticed him watching. Her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Thomas nodded toward the old rocking chair near the window. "You can sit there, if you like," he offered. "Gets the best light this time of day." She nodded and eased herself into the seat. Her eyes scanned the prairie, far and wide, like she expected something or someone to appear at any moment. She held her arms tight across her chest, fingers clutching the shawl like armor. After a while, she whispered, "He wasn't supposed to hurt me." The words came out like an admission, or a confession she hadn't meant to say aloud. Thomas looked up slowly. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was still fixed on the land outside, though now her jaw was clenched, and her eyes glistened. "Who?" he asked softly. "My husband," she replied, her voice cold and flat. "Or the man who said he was." Thomas sat down across from her, elbows resting on his knees, watching her carefully but without pushing. "We were married in a camp 2 days ago. He said he loved me, said he'd take care of me." She swallowed, as if her throat were raw. "Then, something changed. He took my things, locked me in a wagon, said I belonged to him now, said I'd brought shame. I tried to leave, I ran." Thomas felt his hands curl into fists at his sides. He didn't need every detail to understand what kind of man she had escaped from. Her torn veil, her bruised temple, her bare feet. They told the rest of the story. "You don't belong to anyone," he said, his voice low, uncertain. She looked at him, then really looked in this time. A tear slipped free down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Outside, a hawk circled in the sky, its cry sharp against the wind. The land was waking again, drying from the storm, coming back to life. But in Thomas's cabin, a reckoning was building. He didn't know when the man or men who hurt her would come looking, but if they did, they'd find something they didn't expect. A quiet rancher who wasn't nearly as alone or as helpless as he had once been. And this time, he had something worth standing for. The silence between them lasted for the better part of an hour. Neither of them spoke, but there was a quiet communication in the way they shared the space. The young woman, still unnamed, still a mystery, sat in the rocking chair, her gaze fixed on the fields, lost in thoughts she didn't seem ready to share. Thomas remained seated near the hearth, sharpening one of his old knives with long, steady strokes. The soft rasp of metal on stone, the only sound between them. It was the kind of silence that didn't demand to be filled, just respected. But underneath the calm, Thomas could feel a shift. Something was coming. It wasn't just paranoia. The land had a way of telling him things before they happened. That moved differently, the wind that seemed to carry tension instead of peace. He had learned to trust it over the years, and now, that deep instinct whispered in his bones. Someone was near. He stood quietly and moved toward the window that faced east. His ranch sat on a wide patch of open prairie, surrounded by low hills. In tall grass, he could usually see a visitor coming from a mile off. But this time, something was wrong. A low vibration traveled through the floorboards beneath his feet. So faint, it could have been mistaken for wind, except it wasn't. He stepped outside onto the porch and listened. At first, he heard nothing. But then, just at the edge of hearing, came the faint sound of hooves. Not one horse. Many. His eyes scanned the horizon, and then he saw them. Figures on horseback, dozens, no, hundreds, emerging from the hills to the north. Silent and orderly, not galloping but riding with purpose. They weren't charging. They weren't armed in any threatening way that he could see, but they were coming straight toward his ranch. The sun caught flashes of painted faces, feathers, and glinting beads. Apache warriors, at least 300 of them, riding in formation. And at the front, a tall man in a white furred headdress and bone chestplate, his expression unreadable from a distance. Thomas didn't panic. He didn't even move. He had seen Apache riders before, but never like this, not in such numbers. Not so suddenly, not without any warning from the neighboring settlements. This was something different. Behind him, he heard the door creak. She had come out. The young woman stepped onto the porch beside him, one hand still clutching the shawl around her shoulders. She followed his gaze, and when she saw the riders, she went pale as chalk, her knees buckled, and Thomas caught her just before she collapsed. "No," she breathed. "They found me." Thomas steadied her. "Do you know them?" She nodded, trembling. "The one in front, that's Red Elk. He's my father." Thomas blinked. "Your father?" She nodded again. "They must have followed the trail through the storm. He must have come to find me. But if he sees your rifle, if he thinks you kept me," Thomas raised a hand. "I didn't touch a weapon, and I'm not about to." She looked up at him, eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand. They think every white man is the same. They think I was taken. If they think you hurt me, ... Thomas looked out at the approaching riders. He understood now. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't revenge. This was a rescue. And unless handled carefully, it could turn into a bloodbath. He turned to her, speaking calmly. Then tell them the truth. Tell them you weren't taken. Tell them I helped you. She looked down, gripping the edge of the porch rail as the ground began to tremble with the rhythm of the riders. They may not listen, she whispered. Thomas nodded, jaw set. Then I will. And with that, he stepped down off the porch and walked slowly to the center of his front yard. Arms open, hat in hand as 300 Apache warriors rode toward him. With judgment in their eyes and thunder in their hearts. The earth shook beneath Thomas's boots as the line of riders drew closer. Dust rose in slow, curling columns behind the horses, the air thick with the scent of sweat, leather, and iron. Thomas kept his hands visible, arms spread slightly away from his body, not in surrender, but in openness, a gesture of peace. He had no rifle, no pistol at his hip, and he made no move toward the barn where his shotgun was hidden just inside the door. Violence would only spark more violence, and Thomas had lived too long to mistake pride for survival. Behind him, the young woman stood frozen at the top of the porch steps, eyes locked on the lead rider, the tall man in the white furred headdress. His horse was massive, jet black with a streak of white down its muzzle. The man's face was sharp and stoic, weathered by time and war. Beads clinked softly in his braids, and his chest was bare, save for the ceremonial armor of bones and sinew. This was a man who had seen bloodshed, led warriors into battle, and walked away with stories that no one else had survived to tell. The Apache riders came to a halt in perfect unison, just 20 yards from the fence line. The silence that followed was louder than their arrival, in unnatural quiet, as though even the wind was waiting. Thomas took one careful step forward and raised his voice, not loud, but steady. My name is Thomas Granger, he said. This woman came to my door in the middle of the storm. She was alone. She was hurt. I gave her food, water, a place to rest. That's all. No one moved. The horses shifted their weight and snorted softly, but not a single rider reached for a weapon. Still, Thomas could feel the air charged like a wire pulled tight. The man in the headdress nudged his horse forward with barely a gesture. He stopped just outside the wooden fence and dismounted in one fluid motion, his feet landing silently in the grass. Up close, Thomas could see the years etched in the man's face, but also a fierce, unrelenting energy in his eyes. This was a chief, a father, and right now, a storm all his own. She is my daughter, the man said. His voice was deep, calm, and frighteningly clear. Her name is Sandy. Thomas nodded slowly. She told me. Where is the man who took her? The chief asked. There is no man here but me. The chief's gaze hardened. Then what am I to believe, rancher? Before Thomas could respond, a soft voice called out from behind him. Father, everyone, turned. The girl Sandy was stepping off the porch, barefoot in the grass. The shawl clutched tightly around her thin frame. Her legs wobbled with every step, but she didn't stop. She walked past Thomas and stood between him and the wall of mounted warriors, her face pale but resolute. This man did not take me, she said, voice shaking. He gave me shelter. He gave me warmth. He gave me kindness when no one else did. I ran from my husband, not to another man, but to safety. The words hit like a drumbeat through the crowd. Some of the warriors looked at one another. The chief didn't move. I was forced into a union, Sandy continued. A man who beat me, caged me, lied to you. I escaped the camp during the rain. I followed the river until I collapsed. I would have died. Father, this man, this rancher, he saved me. Thomas didn't speak. He didn't need to. The chief looked at his daughter, long and hard, and then slowly approached. He raised one hand and touched her cheek, brushing aside a tear with the back of his fingers. Then, he turned to Thomas. I owe you a debt, he said, voice solemn. Thomas shook his head. You owe me nothing. She needed help, that's all. But the chief held his gaze. That may be true, but a man is known by how he treats those with nothing to offer. He looked to his warriors, raised his hand, and gave a sharp signal. The riders dismounted, not in aggression, but in reverence. One by one, they knelt, silent and still, in the fields outside the ranch. 300 Apache warriors bowing, not to Thomas, but to the act itself. And in that moment, Thomas realized something he hadn't felt in a decade. Belonging. The late afternoon sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the prairie in long streaks of amber and crimson. The stillness that followed the kneeling of the Apache warriors was surreal, almost sacred. For a few breathless minutes, no one moved, horse or bird. It was as if the land itself recognized the gravity of what had just transpired. And at the center of it all stood Thomas Granger, weathered rancher, silent observer, and now, unexpected bridge between two worlds long divided by fear and misunderstanding. Sandy stood beside her father, her shawl fluttering gently in the wind. There was strength in her now, even if her body still trembled. She looked over at Thomas, and for the first time since she'd arrived at his doorstep, she smiled, faint but true. It was the kind of smile that held pain, yes, but also gratitude and hope. Chief Red Elk turned once more to Thomas. In our ways, he said slowly, we do not forget the hand that gives without asking, nor the heart that shelters the hunted. He looked out across the silent, kneeling warriors. You have shown honor to my daughter, and in doing so, you have shown it to all of us. Thomas felt the lump rising in his throat but forced himself to swallow it down. I just did what anyone ought to do. Red Elk gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Perhaps, but few do. He then motioned to one of his lieutenants, a younger warrior with braids down his back and turquoise beads woven into his sash. The man stepped forward and placed a bundle at Thomas's feet, trapped in soft leather and bound with sinew. When Thomas opened it, he found inside a blade hand-forged, curved, and marked with tribal symbols. A blade from my people, the chief said, given not for war but for guardianship. May you never need to draw it in anger. But if the day comes, let it remind you that you do not stand alone. Thomas held the weapon with quiet reverence. It was beautiful, balanced, alive with meaning. Thank you, he said simply. The warriors began to rise one by one, silent as the wind. Horses were mounted. Voices murmured in a tongue Thomas didn't understand but respected deeply. A few approached him personally, offering a nod, a gesture, or a hand briefly laid on his shoulder. No words, just acknowledgement. Then, as swiftly and silently as they had arrived, they turned their horses back toward the northern hills. Only Sanny and Red Elk remained. She must choose her path now. Red Elk said, turning to his daughter, "You are free, Sanny, as I should have made you from the beginning." Tears welled in her eyes again. "You believed him. You let him take me." "I did," he admitted, "and I have carried that shame every mile since." Thomas looked away, giving them the space they needed, but Sanny stepped toward him. "I cannot go back to that life," she said quietly. "You don't have to." Thomas replied. She glanced at her father, who nodded once, then turned and mounted his horse. Without another word, the chief rode after his warriors. Disappearing slowly into the fading gold of the prairie, Sanny stood at the edge of the porch, arms crossed tightly, eyes scanning the land. Thomas stepped beside her, unsure of what to say. Finally, he asked, "You got somewhere you want to go?" She hesitated, then looked at him with calm certainty. "I'd like to stay, if that's all right." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "You're welcome here, as long as you like." The prairie stretched wide and quiet around them again, but it didn't feel empty anymore. Somewhere, in the hush that followed all storms, something had changed, not just in the land, but in Thomas himself. He had lived alone for a decade, by choice, out of grief, out of fear. But now, with a blade at his belt, a story etched into the earth, and a brave soul standing at his side, he knew he'd never truly be alone again. Not after what they'd shared, not after what they'd survived.